The Korean offline mafia. One of the most polarizing topics for the few who know about it. Depending on who you ask, they're either blatant cheaters, or some of the best players of all time. What is the Korean offline mafia, and can it really live up to that expectation? Okay, let's first start with what the Korean offline mafia is. Well, to put it simply, it's a group of banned Korean players who play offline. But why Korean specifically? Well, there's a combination of Korea's isolation from the rest of the world and the reputation of extreme competitiveness in games made them pretty much the perfect place for the idea of an offline group of gods to originate. But although this makes it sound somewhat simple, it really couldn't be more complicated, because the Korean offline mafia is just a blanket term for a huge amount of players that stretches from legendary to Haidano. And although the Korean reputation and isolation are some of the main reasons for the idea of the Korean offline mafia, the fact that there are many more Korean offline players almost certainly comes from one of the most famous incidents in Osu history, Kakizi's ban. Since the way he self-banned himself out of discontent for staff, then played offline, and then came back with a bang, was technically one of the first cases of someone being in the Korean offline mafia. And since he's one of the most famous players ever, and a lot of people's inspiration, he basically popularized playing offline, especially in Korea. And that, along with how difficult it can sometimes be to become unbanned, made it so that Korea has many of the most interesting cases of players playing offline. So, let's take a look at some of the members of this so-called mafia, and see just how legit it is. Starting with a fun one. Legendary. Legendary is probably the most famous hacker of all time, with his image material play having 700,000 views despite being hacked. Which seems pretty clear in hindsight, since his cursor did look like this on the slow part. But at the time it was a lot less clear, since cheats were nowhere near as good, and also not as known. And even though it's sort of a meme now, there were actually a fair few people who thought he was legit. A while after this play, he was banned, presumably for cheating. But funnily enough, he was later unbanned, just around the time that White Cat was, which could make his case a bit stronger. But after a few decent scores, he set a Storyteller's DT play, which almost seemed to be spitting in the face of staff after unbanning him. And so, he was once again banned. Probably forever this time. Asuna is one of the most interesting cases, because he is one of the most secretive, even out of this group of offline players who no one knows much about. But he's pretty famous for just how many multi-accounts he's had, and that in 2017 there was at least one that was still up and high ranked. He's also been known to boost other Korean accounts, with the best example being Taka, who was banned for account sharing or cheating. There would still be a bit of mystery around whether or not he was banned for multi-accounting with Asuna, or for Asuna cheating on his account, if not for... Haidano is an account famous for reaching the number 38 spot before being banned. He had a lot of suspicion going around him for ages, and one day he finally uploaded a live play that was so obviously time-warped that he deleted it the next day. This convinced basically everyone of his illegitimacy. But the funniest part to me is that Haidano is almost certainly Asuna under one of his multi-accounts, and so his ban also subsequently confirmed Asuna's illegitimacy. But although all the examples so far have been pretty well-known cheaters, there are some other pretty fascinating cases, which are a whole lot less clear-cut. Shizuru, an aim god who to this day has some plays that are nearly uncontested, and Hakurei, who was the best player in the world after Kakizi's self-ban. Both exceptional Korean players, and both ones who only had a small bit of suspicion going around him. But after a pretty infamous cheater list by Horo, which is essentially just throwing out random names with little to no evidence, which they were included on, they both decided to self-ban. They have both since been unbanned, with Shizuru making it all the way to the top 100, and Hakurei coming back and making it to number 5 in 2015, until RSI led him to mostly quit playing the game competitively. But this is a pretty clear example of how an offline player can be completely legit and insanely good, and it leads us perfectly into the case of Huyu, or Idki with a Y. He played online for about 7 years before being banned for pretty mysterious reasons. He has a good live play, or at least one that's much better than many unbanned players, and all I could really find on him was an Osu report suspicious thread, which basically just says that he's too good for his playtime. Yeah, not really great evidence. And he also streams, and has a really good hand cam video, which when subjected to a gameplay overlay, looks basically perfect. And so maybe he was banned for other reasons, but as it stands, he's certainly the most legit seeming out of the banned players, and he has some incredible scores, like an Angry for Hard Rock FC, that would almost certainly put him up there with the best Hard Rock players in the world right now. And finally, I'll end with one that represents just how good offline players can be. Jotbab, one of the fastest players of all time, and one who you might have heard of pretty recently, for his 900 on Union with double time and flashlight, was actually banned for years because of multi-accounting. Or at least that was consensus at the time he was banned. After being banned for a while though, there was at least a bit of suspicion going around him, until finally at the end of 2017, he was unbanned and now has played legitimately for years. But I do think that one interesting thing about this is that if you saw a player get a DT flashlight choke on Union worth almost 1000 PP offline, what would you think of it? Which leads to my conclusion. Obviously, this video can't cover everyone who falls into this category, but I chose these examples to show how while yes, some offline players are pretty clearly cheaters, there can also be people who have other reasons, with someone like Huyu, who has streams and has a pretty good live play, or Jotbab, who was banned for years for a pretty minor offense. And I think one of the most fascinating things is just how ambiguous these players' legitimacy can be, especially because there can be someone like Whitecat who has scores that no one else could do offline, and although you could definitely argue for both sides, whether they're legit or not is up to you. And I think that's pretty great. Okay, it's the end of the video. I just wanted to thank Skill and Firedigger for basically making this possible, and if you liked the video, I guess subscribing would be much appreciated.